Well, ladies and gentlemen, this is Steve with my audio stuff, and I think some of you have thought about this. You probably haven't asked for it, but I might as well give it to you. As you recall, about a month ago, I released a video on a realistic tape deck or Radio Shack tape deck that I had, which was the SCT 31, and it garnered about 800 views just from a lousy 3-head deck. So I figured I would give some of you snobs a look at what many would consider to be the creme de la creme of Radio Shack tape decks, realistic tape decks. This is the bigger brother of the SCT 31 3-head tape deck. It came out the same year, 1981-82. This is the SCT, and I'll close up on it here, 3100 from Realistic or Radio Shack. And for many, this represents the finest of all the tape decks that Radio Shack would ever build. They would make one more 3-head tape deck after this for the 1982-83 catalog year, but it would not be a dual Capistan tape deck, which is what this one is. And I'll show you some of that. This isn't a perfect deck. I'm still restoring it. There's still some things that don't work perfectly in this thing. And I'm not going to tell you how much I paid for it on eBay. But anyway, I just thought I would show it to everybody here. Fairly heavy deck. You can see I've already taken the back off so I can show everybody this thing. But I might as well show you the dual Capistans on this. You can see them right here. And again, this is a 3-head deck. So this is a record and playback head. It's not a combo head. There are 2 separate heads joined together at the center. And then, of course, over here is the erase head. So it's a 3-head deck. But the real impressive thing is that this is dual Capistan. There's a Capistan and pinch roller there. And then there's a Capistan and pinch roller over here. And the reason why I'm not really any fan of these is because if your belts start to slip, and most of these systems are 4-belt systems, so each Capistan has its own belt. If the belt slips on one but not the other, you can get into situations where it starts to stretch your tape. The tape can become wrapped around one of the Capistans, all sorts of nasty things. So I'm no real fan of these, and on top of the fact that you have 2 Capistans mashing your tape into 2 pinch rollers. So again, that might make some people feel better because the tape is being held in such a secure way, but I think some of the damage that these things can potentially do to your tape probably, for me at least, are greater than the benefits of the dual Capistan design. Obviously, it holds your tape, I think, better against your head, but then again, it's probably somewhat debatable. But this is a dual Capistan design. It has 4 belts. I replaced all 4 belts, so nothing slips. Lubricated the motors. This is a dual motor design, so you have two motors, one for fast forward and rewind, and the other for the dual Capistans, all of that. This is kind of impressive. On top of being a solenoid deck, and all that stuff works perfectly, this also has a electrical or an electricized tape counter on it, and you can either set this thing up to stop at a particular setting, or you can set this thing up to auto play. And that simply means that if this thing gets to the end of the tape, it'll auto rewind, as it says here, and then start the tape over and play it. The auto stop is if you set this thing to 0, and it can be in the middle of your tape, and have that set to auto stop. It'll stop when the tape counter reads 0. So maybe there's a song you like. You can 0 it out at the start of the song and then put that on the stop setting, and it'll rewind to it and stop right there. Also, auto timer doesn't mean there's a timer built into this. It simply means you can plug in a timer to this thing, and when this thing receives power, as long as the power button is on, it will either play when power is restored to it, or record when power is restored to it. Some people would have an FM broadcast that they wanted to get at a particular time, and they weren't home, so providing that their receiver was on and the power button was depressed on this thing, it would turn on at that particular time. Anyway, so this is also one of the last tape models to feature analog gauges. The smaller brother of this, the SCT 31, which I have a video for and you can look at it, has LED gauges. But this one has analog gauges. Not a bad touch. They don't respond as fast, but to help compensate for that, they would give you dual LEDs for peaking at 3 or peaking at 6, and the standard LED for the Dolby noise reduction, all of that. Here's some of the controls really quick on it. Bias adjustment, you can either do it by ear, since this is a 3-head deck, obviously. You can play and record simultaneously, but for the connoisseurs, you could put the tape in record mode, and then you would hit that button on the top which says test, and it would give you a 400 kilohertz or 400 hertz tone in 1 meter and a 10 kilohertz tone, I believe, in the other. And then you would adjust that so that both meters read the same. And there you'd have your bias adjustment. And then, of course, the tape formulation is pretty impressive, though. This thing would play everything. And for the smaller cousin, when I was 17, I got ferrochrome and chrome and metal, and it would play them all. Unfortunately, ferrochrome, which I am still a fan of that tape, and metal are no longer available. The two tape formulations that are still being produced by some people, believe it or not, are normal and chromium, though you can get all these formulations, obviously, on eBay and some even on Amazon if you're willing to pay a little more. For this particular deck, like the SCT 31, probably the best tapes for this would be the Maxells. The Maxell, UDs or URs for normal tape, and then the Maxell XL2s for chromium dioxide tapes. Those are the tapes I think that this was more or less made to work with, the equalization circuitry, all of that. So you'll probably get the best results out of that. You can see here, very standard with 3-head tape decks, reel-to-reels or cassettes. It had the tape monitor and then the source. So you could record and play back at exactly the same time. This also features, double Dolby, so it'll record and play back in Dolby at the exact same time. And you could also calibrate the Dolby. Most decks, even before this and after this, the Dolby was more or less hit and miss calibrated at the factory. They'd calibrate it, give you more of a ballpark figure. But this one, you can actually calibrate the Dolby before you start using the tape. So you do the bias calibration first, then the Dolby calibration. I think more or less doing it this way gives you less, what's the word for it? Compression sounding recordings. Because you could tweak this, you could get it more to the way the people in the Dolby laboratories wanted it to sound, which is impressive. And then, of course, you had the output level, and that was primarily for the headphones, but also for the line outs, then the record left and right. And then my favorite, the microphone jacks, which are on the front of all these decks, regardless of what you got, and nobody would use them, but they were there. Probably a leftover from the 60s and 70s reel-to-reels. The majority of the recording, of course, were done through the back line-in jacks. Okay, well, now for all of you people, yes, this is what you've been waiting for, the actual electronics of this deck. This is a pretty heavy deck, to be truthful. This, I think, has a little larger of a power transformer than the SCT 31 does, but that's primarily because it has to power a lot more electronics. And this is the dual Capistan tape unit. It's pretty heavy. I had to remove this to fix some of the things in here, but you can see the belts in this and maybe get you a little better look at it. So this is the main Capistan with its own flywheel, and that's the secondary Capistan with its own flywheel and belt. And they both have individual belts, and then you can look at the fast forward, rewind, and tape counter section. That's another 2 belts. So all told on this thing, I think this is a 4-belt system. I think that's what this has. Maybe I'm wrong on that. Maybe it's a 5, but I'm not sure. It's been a while since I have worked on this, but I'm not going to tear into this thing again. But it does work fine. Fast forward, rewind work fine. The dual Capistans work fine. But again, I'm always nervous with these because they have a nasty habit, even when they work well, of chewing tapes up. This is the main circuit board, and you can see on this particular deck, unlike the SCT 31, there are so many electronics, and the power demand is so high that it has 2 separate circuit boards. This is the main power supply circuit board. I went ahead and replaced the diodes, went ahead and replaced the capacitors, and then this is the main circuit board here, and the power supply sort of continues on to this board as well. And you can see just the extensive electronics in this thing. Those are the Dolby circuits. That's the double Dolby. And then this, more or less, is the record circuit. It's way in the back, kind of where some of the playback circuitry is as well. But you can see the record oscillators. They're 85 kilohertz. And then you can also see something that I really don't like, which are those two black things. Those are the op-amp chips. I think they use that for the audio on this thing. The SCT-31, it was all discrete circuitry. And I think overall, the SCT-31 is probably the better deck of these two. Maybe somebody would disagree with me, but this uses some integrated circuitry in the audio paths. That's probably just to save space and expense because this thing incorporated so much on one single circuit board. Just kind of getting into it a little more, you can see some of these are the bias trap coils here, so that your bias doesn't whistle down into the audio range. And then I think these here are the FM traps, or the 19 kilohertz tone, to shut those off. And then this, I think, is what most of you would want to adjust if you're having high frequency issues. And if I go out here, this, I believe, is the erase head bias oscillator. It's not the record head bias oscillators. See, those are here, and they're fixed at 85 kilohertz. But the erase head bias oscillator, and if you turn this thing, and there probably some of you wouldn't want to do it, but if you turn it about a turn and a half to the right, it will boost your high frequency material. It's probably just because it gives you a little higher bias on the erase head, which pairs the tape a little better. But you can fiddle with that. I did that with my SCT-31 with good results. And providing that the tape head and all of that are in good shape, you can probably get away doing that, and you'll get fairly decent high frequency response. But once again, you can see just how much circuitry this thing has. Really quick, there are some questions on the tape head and all of that. If you look at these, the record and playback tape head on this, these are two separate heads. It's not a combo head. You would think it is, but it's not. And it's kind of hard to see because the metal on the head, if you look at it, is really dark. And that's because this is a ferric head. And ferric metals are generally darker, but Radio Shack chose to use that because they had a high enough saturation rate to where they could record with metal. And I think given that, they're probably also a little better on high frequency response as well. Sort of like the precursor to the amorphous head, which you'd see in the late 80s and mid-90s on some decks, which was a definite improvement. But I thought I would just show that to you. Not my favorite of decks, and I still have some more work to do on this before it's completely up to snuff. But I've done a lot of this, or done a lot of the work on it already. From 1981-82, the Radio Shack or Realistic SCT-3100. If you're interested, I have another website attached to this YouTube channel, and I'm also on Rumble as well. It's called A Father's Devotions, and you can check that out. Well, that's about all I have, folks. This is Steve with My Audio Stuff, and God bless you all.